It started as a quiet announcement, one that barely made headlines outside of Ontario. General Motors, the American auto giant that once promised to lead Canada into the electric future, had decided to shut down production of its BrightDrop electric vans. The decision hit like a punch in the gut. Hundreds of workers were suddenly left in limbo, local suppliers froze contracts, and small towns built around the hum of factory life went silent. For many, it felt like déjà vu, another American corporation packing up, leaving Canadians to pick up the pieces. But this time, something was different. There was no chaos, no collapse, no desperate political theater. While GM executives framed the decision as a cost-saving move, insiders knew the truth ran deeper. This was fallout from the White House's 25% vehicle tariff, a policy that was supposed to punish Canada but instead sent shockwaves through Detroit. The very company that once symbolized U.S. industrial dominance was now kneecapped by America's own trade war. And here's where the story flips. Because while Washington fumed and factories across the U.S. struggled, Canada stayed calm, almost unnervingly calm. Behind closed doors, Ottawa had already prepared for this exact scenario. What began as a potential economic disaster soon turned into one of the greatest strategic pivots in modern Canadian history. The world saw a shutdown. But Canada saw an opening, a chance to test its new model, an economy built not on reaction but on resilience. As the U.S. stumbled under the weight of its own tariffs, Canada quietly began rewriting the rules of industrial survival. And in the process, it exposed something the world had long overlooked, that true power doesn't come from muscle, it comes from mastery. This is Northern Pulse, and this is how Canada just turned GM's shutdown into its biggest win yet. When the BrightDrop plant in Ingersoll, Ontario went quiet, it wasn't just machinery that stopped. It was a whole rhythm of life. The steady hum of electric van production, the chatter of shift workers, the daily rhythm of a factory town, all gone overnight. For decades, the auto plants of southern Ontario had been the lifeblood of local economies. Families built their lives around them. And when GM announced that production was ending, many feared history was repeating itself, another chapter in the long story of corporate abandonment. But the silence that followed wasn't despair, it was focus. Within hours of the shutdown, local councils met with union leaders, suppliers, and provincial officials. They weren't asking what now, they were asking what next. Retraining programs were already in motion, small manufacturers quickly redirected production toward domestic projects, and workers began enrolling in new green tech certifications. It wasn't luck, it was preparation. What outsiders didn't realize was that Canada had spent years quietly rehearsing for this kind of shock. The federal government's Industrial Resilience Plan wasn't just paperwork, it was a living system. Local mayors and trade officials knew how to activate it. When the announcement came, funding flowed in days, not months. Support programs kept families afloat, while new contracts were signed for infrastructure and battery research within the same communities GM had just vacated. In America, a closure like this would have triggered panic and protests. But in Canada, calm was strategy. The message was clear, one company's exit wouldn't define an entire economy. The world expected collapse, what they got instead was composure. And as the dust settled in Ingersoll, a quiet realization took hold, this wasn't a tragedy at all. It was the beginning of something entirely new. But what triggered this calm revolution? The spark came from Washington. The chaos that hit Ontario didn't start in Ontario. It began thousands of miles away in Washington with a signature and a smirk. In a move meant to protect American jobs, the Trump administration slapped a 25% tariff on all vehicles built in Canada. The goal was simple: force automakers to move back to U.S. soil. But the result? A self-inflicted wound that would bleed through America's own auto industry. Within weeks, the numbers turned ugly. GM's internal reports showed over $1 billion in tariff costs in just one quarter. And that figure was projected to rise to $5 billion annually. Parts that once moved freely across the border now sat trapped in warehouses, tangled in paperwork and politics. Production lines slowed, deadlines slipped, and profit margins vanished. Automakers were forced to make impossible choices, and shutting down the BrightDrop plant in Canada became one of them. But the irony was brutal. The tariffs that were supposed to punish Canada ended up punishing Detroit. U.S. factories, dependent on the same cross-border supply chains, were suddenly crippled by soaring costs and shortages. By trying to bring jobs home, Washington had actually made it harder to build anything at home at all. Meanwhile, north of the border, Canada didn't panic. It didn't retaliate with loud threats or political theatrics. Instead, Ottawa went silent and strategic. Every major automaker operating in Canada was quietly briefed on emergency relief options. Funds were set aside, supply chains restructured, and trade offices began scouting new export partners. While Trump's tariffs shattered confidence in American markets, Canada used the shock as fuel for transformation. The US started a trade war, but Canada turned it into a blueprint. And what Ottawa did next would flip the entire North American auto industry on its head. While the US scrambled to contain the chaos it had created, Canada responded with precision. No shouting, no retaliation, no political grandstanding, just quiet, calculated moves. Within days of GM's shutdown announcement, Ottawa rolled out a three-phase stabilization plan that looked more like a surgeon's operation than a government reaction. Relief programs were activated, tax credits expanded, and regional support funds redirected toward affected towns like Ingersoll. It wasn't improvisation, it was a pre-planned maneuver Canada had spent years preparing for. The government's focus wasn't revenge, it was resilience. Where Washington swung tariffs like hammers, Ottawa used tools, targeted investments, retraining incentives, and partnerships with private firms to protect supply chains. Suppliers that once relied on U.S. imports were guided toward domestic sources. Grants covered the cost of retooling production lines. Even small machine shops in Windsor and Hamilton were looped into larger contracts, ensuring no one was left behind. By refusing to mirror America's volatility, Canada sent a clear message: stability was its weapon. While U.S. automakers faced layoffs, lawsuits, and investor panic, Canada's manufacturing hubs stayed open and steady. Economists started calling it the shock absorber strategy, a system designed to absorb external hits without losing balance. This calm, methodical response didn't just save jobs, it built confidence. Global investors watching from Europe and Asia began to notice. To them, Canada wasn't just a supplier anymore, it was a safe haven in a storm of economic uncertainty. And the more Washington lashed out with threats, the more Canada's quiet competence stood out. In the end, the tariffs meant to corner Canada only gave it leverage. Because while America was busy breaking supply chains, Canada was busy rebuilding them, stronger, smarter, and entirely its own. But beneath this calm counterattack lay another secret: innovation born from the cold itself. For most countries, winter is just a season. For Canada, it's a testing ground. The shutdown of GM's BrightDrop plant didn't just expose economic fragility, it revealed a deeper truth about the electric revolution. EVs were never built for the cold. When temperatures drop below freezing, battery efficiency plunges, range collapses, and maintenance costs skyrocket. Research by the Canadian Automobile Association found that EVs can lose up to 39% of their range in sub-zero weather. For delivery vans like BrightDrop, that meant delays, missed targets, and frustrated clients. But instead of treating the cold as a curse, Canada treated it as a challenge. Engineers, startups, and universities across Ontario and Quebec began collaborating on one mission: to make electric vehicles thrive in the harshest environments on Earth. New battery materials resistant to freezing temperatures, advanced thermal management systems, and hybrid hydrogen-electric prototypes emerged from labs that just months earlier had been building components for GM. It was a national pivot, one powered by necessity. Companies like Lion Electric, Ballard Power, and Hydrogenics started scaling projects once considered too experimental. Postal fleets began testing hybrid delivery vehicles built entirely in Canada, optimized for northern winters. What had been a weakness was now becoming a competitive edge. And this wasn't happening in isolation. Ottawa funneled research grants into cold-weather EV innovation, while provincial governments offered pilot programs for winter-ready fleets. Suddenly, the same frozen roads that had once limited Canada's EV ambitions became the perfect laboratory for global breakthroughs. GM's shutdown, intended to cut costs, had accidentally sparked a new generation of Canadian engineering. Out of the ice came innovation, proof that resilience wasn't just policy, it was culture. But this innovation didn't appear overnight. It came from years of quiet planning, the very system that would soon redefine Canada's economy itself. Canada's real advantage wasn't luck, it was preparation. Long before tariffs and shutdowns, Ottawa had quietly built what economists now call the shock absorber economy, a system designed to bend under global pressure without ever breaking. Between 2020 and 2024, Canada attracted more than $46 billion in electric vehicle investments, backed by over $52 billion in public incentives, the highest in the G7 relative to GDP. Those weren't random subsidies. They were the scaffolding of a safety net meant to keep industries standing when the next crisis hit. At the core of this model were three decisive tools. First, a $5 billion strategic response fund that could inject cash into companies hurt by tariffs within days, not months. Second, a regional manufacturing stabilization program, which doubled from $450 million to $1 billion just before the GM closure, ensuring towns like Ingersoll never collapsed under layoffs. And third, a $450 million retraining initiative that helped more than 50,000 workers shift into battery production, software integration, and green tech manufacturing. This structure created something rare in modern economies: trust. Factory workers no longer saw government policy as empty promises. They saw it working, paycheck by paycheck. Executives began treating Ottawa not as a regulator but as a partner, planning long-term instead of cutting corners for quarterly profits. The result was momentum and confidence that didn't depend on foreign approval. Meanwhile, across the border, the United States stumbled through bureaucracy and partisan gridlock. Automakers waited months for relief that never came. But in Canada, the response was immediate, surgical, and effective. The BrightDrop shutdown was supposed to trigger panic. Instead, it showcased how well the system worked. Canada didn't just survive the blow, it absorbed it, adapted, and came out stronger. And from that foundation came the boldest move yet: Canada's push for complete industrial independence. For over a century, Canada's manufacturing story had been intertwined with America's: shared borders, shared factories, shared fortunes. But the GM shutdown made one thing painfully clear. Dependence on U.S. demand was a liability. When Washington sneezed, Canadian industries caught a cold. This time, Ottawa refused to play that game. The answer wasn't louder politics, it was quiet reinvention. Canada began building what policymakers called the Made in Canada value chain, a fully domestic network where everything from raw minerals to finished vehicles stayed within national borders. It started deep in the ground. Nickel, lithium, and cobalt, the lifeblood of electric batteries, were no longer being shipped overseas for processing. New refineries and smelters in Ontario, Quebec, and Manitoba began converting Canadian resources into Canadian products. The goal was simple: control the entire supply line from mine to market. By keeping production local, Canada could protect jobs, reduce costs, and free itself from the volatility of American trade politics. Cities like Windsor, St. Thomas, and Alliston transformed into clean-tech hubs. Once known for traditional assembly lines, they became centers of research, robotics, and advanced battery manufacturing. Universities joined forces with startups, sharing patents and training programs, creating a loop of innovation that fed directly into industry. What emerged wasn't just an economy, it was an ecosystem. The shift wasn't loud, but it was revolutionary. Canada was no longer waiting for the U.S. to decide its fate. For the first time in generations, it was designing its own industrial destiny. America had its tariffs. Canada had its transformation. The BrightDrop closure had closed one door, but it opened 1,000 new ones. And soon, those doors would open far beyond North America as Canada prepared to rewrite the rules of global trade itself. As Canada rebuilt its economy from within, something remarkable began to happen. The world started paying attention. Europe, struggling to secure ethical and traceable green supply chains, saw in Canada a partner that actually delivered. Unlike other nations that talked about clean industry while outsourcing the dirty work abroad, Canada was doing it all at home: mining, refining, manufacturing, and exporting, with transparency baked into every stage. This credibility became currency. Within months, Ottawa and Brussels began drafting new agreements linking Canadian minerals and electric vehicle batteries directly to Europe's carbon-neutral targets. The eastward shift marked a historic turning point. For decades, Canada's economy had orbited around Washington, its policies shaped by U.S. demand. Now that orbit was breaking. With European trade accelerating and Asia opening new lanes for green exports, Canada's industrial map stretched across oceans, from the nickel mines of Sudbury to ports in Halifax shipping directly to Rotterdam and Hamburg. What once looked like geographic isolation was suddenly a global advantage: clean energy, stable politics, and a reputation for reliability in an increasingly unstable world. Meanwhile, across the border, America was stuck in an identity crisis. Tariffs had driven up costs, investor confidence was fading, and U.S. automakers were struggling to compete with a quieter, steadier rival next door. Economists began referring to Canada as the anchor economy of the Western Hemisphere, the one country that could take a hit, adapt, and still grow stronger. This wasn't luck or chance, it was design. Every policy, every pivot, every retrained worker had been part of a long game, one that now positioned Canada as the global benchmark for industrial resilience. But for all its new power, Canada's quiet revolution carried a deeper message, one that even General Motors couldn't ignore. When General Motors halted production in Ontario, it believed it was cutting costs. But what it really did was cut itself off from the one market that had learned how to thrive without chaos. Months after the shutdown, as GM struggled with soaring expenses in the US and shifting supply chains, its executives started seeing something they hadn't expected. Canada wasn't crumbling, it was rising. The same towns once defined by GM's presence were now buzzing with new projects, new investors, and a new sense of control. The BrightDrop closure was supposed to show the limits of Canada's industrial strength. Instead, it revealed the limits of America's arrogance. Ottawa didn't fight GM, it outlasted it. While Detroit's factories battled uncertainty and political gamesmanship, Ontario's workshops evolved into innovation labs. Canadian-built components began flowing into European and Asian EV markets faster than GM could rebuild its own logistics. The message was clear. Canada no longer needed validation from Detroit. Even GM quietly began to circle back. Analysts noted that despite its earlier retreat, the company continued investing in Canadian battery partnerships and research programs, proof that it had realized where true stability lay. In an ironic twist, the corporation that tried to hurt Canada had ended up depending on it. This was more than a business story. It was a statement of identity. Canada had turned disruption into design, crisis into competence, and dependency into dominance. The shutdown wasn't an ending, it was an awakening. And for a world trapped between political chaos and economic uncertainty, Canada had offered a lesson GM never saw coming. That quiet strength, steady vision, and unshakable unity can turn even a factory's silence into the sound of a nation rising. This is Northern Pulse, where resilience isn't reaction, it's power. When history looks back at the BrightDrop shutdown, it won't see a tragedy, it'll see a turning point. What began as a corporate retreat ended as a national reinvention. GM thought it could walk away and leave Canada scrambling. Instead, it left behind the spark that ignited an industrial renaissance. From frozen factory floors in Ontario to new trade corridors stretching across Europe and Asia, Canada turned a moment of vulnerability into a blueprint for modern resilience. This wasn't luck and it wasn't noise. It was strategy, years of careful groundwork paying off when the world least expected it. While the US drowned in its own tariffs, Canada wrote the manual for stability. It built an economy that doesn't break when shocks hit, it adapts. One that doesn't beg for foreign approval, but earns global respect through consistency, foresight, and results. The shutdown that was meant to weaken Canada only exposed its strength. Today, the same regions GM abandoned are leading the next wave of clean tech innovation. The same workers once laid off are now pioneers in hydrogen, battery systems, and circular manufacturing. The same cold climate that once limited ambition now fuels breakthroughs that other nations can't match. The world expected Canada to fall in line behind America's trade wars. Instead, it quietly walked its own path, one built on calm confidence, not chaos. The message is unmistakable. Canada no longer defines itself by its proximity to power, but by its command of progress. GM may have started this story, but Canada finished it on its own terms. Because in a world obsessed with headlines, Canada proved that true victories don't always roar. Sometimes they rise in silence. This is Northern Pulse, revealing how quiet power always wins in the end.